We were standing at the East Wing security checkpoint of the White House when my mother shoved her gold-embossed VIP invitation directly in my face. "You were not invited," she sneered, gesturing for a Secret Service agent to come over and escort me out. I did not argue. I simply stepped forward and handed my digital pass to the hostess. The scanner beeped a loud, distinct tone. The hostess froze, her eyes widening as she turned completely pale. She looked frantically toward the highly decorated military official standing nearby. "Sir," she stammered, her voice shaking. "She is here. My name is Caroline Pierce, and I am 34 years old. For my entire life, my family treated me like the designated failure, a glorified tech support worker who could never measure up to their high society standards. But they had no idea that the very government contract they were desperately trying to secure that night depended entirely on my signature." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever proven your toxic family wrong in the most spectacular way possible. The air in the grand foyer of the White House was thick with tension and the low hum of Washington elite networking. Generals, senators, and defense contractors mingled under the glowing crystal chandeliers, holding expensive champagne flutes. I stood quietly in my tailored white blazer, observing the room, when my mother, Catherine Pierce, marched up to me with furious determination. She adjusted her designer wrap, her face twisted with absolute disgust. "What on earth are you doing here, Caroline?" she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper meant to cut deep. "This is a highly classified private gala for federal defense contractors and political dignitaries. You are going to embarrass us in front of the entire Defense Department. Get out of this building right now, before I have the security team throw you out onto Pennsylvania Avenue." My older sister Beatrice stepped up right beside our mother, linking her arm tightly through her husband Xavier's arm. Xavier Washington was a towering, charismatic African-American corporate lobbyist. He was currently sweating through his custom Tom Ford suit, aggressively preparing his mind to pitch a $100 million logistics software contract to the Pentagon officials tonight. Beatrice glared at me, her diamond earrings catching the light as she shook her head in sheer contempt. "You always do this to me, Caroline." Beatrice snapped, pointing an accusing finger at my chest. "Just like when you completely ruined my sweet 16 party because you selfishly refused to write my final history term paper for me. Now you are showing up here uninvited, trying to ruin Xavier's big night. We are about to secure generational wealth. Go back to your cheap basement apartment in the suburbs and leave the real business to the adults who actually matter." Xavier leaned in close, his physical presence designed to intimidate me. His voice dropped to a low, threatening rumble that only our small circle could hear. "I have $50 million in commission riding on tonight, Caroline." He glared down at me with ruthless ambition. "I am not letting some glorified help desk dropout ruin my networking opportunities." Xavier turned his head and waved his hand authoritatively. "Security," he called out, catching the attention of a stone-faced Secret Service agent stationed near the metal detectors. "This woman is harassing my family and does not have the proper security clearance to be in the East Wing. Please escort her off the premises immediately before she causes a major disruption." My father, Richard, the arrogant CEO of Pierce Logistics, stood slightly behind the group. He did not say a single word to defend me. Instead, he just crossed his arms and nodded in agreement with Xavier, clearly humiliated by my mere presence at an event he believed was far above my social standing. His silent judgment was a familiar weapon, one he had used to control and belittle me since childhood. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my living situation, my career, or my right to be there. I simply maintained my calm composure, stepped right past my mother's outstretched arm, and approached the chief hostess standing behind the mahogany podium. I held up my phone displaying a secure encrypted barcode. The hostess, a stern and highly trained woman who had just checked in 3 state senators without blinking an eye, scanned my screen. The device flashed a brilliant pulsing green light displaying the words "Level 1 Alpha Clearance" across her monitor. Her breath hitched audibly. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her visibly shaken. She looked at the screen, then stared at me with wide eyes, and frantically signaled to the military officials near the grand staircase. Admiral Jonathan Reed, a 55-year-old veteran with a chest covered in distinguished medals, immediately noticed the signal and cut a path straight through the crowded room. Xavier saw the high-ranking official approaching and instantly puffed out his chest. He smoothed his expensive tie, stepped forward with his hand extended, and activated his polished lobbyist charm. Admiral Reed Xavier began flashing a perfectly practiced million-dollar smile. "It is an absolute honor to meet you, sir. I represent Pierce Logistics, and we are so thrilled to present our new software integration to your committee tonight." Admiral Reed did not even look at Xavier. He walked right past my brother-in-law's outstretched hand, leaving Xavier frozen in mid-air like a statue. The Admiral stopped directly in front of me, stood at strict military attention, and extended his hand with a look of deep, unmistakable respect. "Ms. Pierce," Admiral Reed said, his voice carrying clearly over the quiet murmurs of the surrounding elite crowd. "The Joint Chiefs are waiting for your final security briefing in the Oval Office. We absolutely could not start the evening's proceedings without you here to authorize the clearance codes." The heavy silence that crashed over my family was absolute and magnificent. My mother's mouth hung wide open in sheer disbelief. Beatrice lost her grip on her expensive designer clutch, letting it drop with a loud thud onto the polished marble floor. Xavier slowly lowered his rejected hand, his charismatic smile melting into a twisted mask of pure, unadulterated shock. They stood entirely paralyzed at the security gate, suddenly realizing that the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like worthless trash was not a pathetic, uninvited +1, but the most critical VIP in the entire building. The heavy oak doors of the grand foyer swung shut behind me, sealing my family outside with their shock, while I stepped into the gleaming heart of Washington Power. The United States Marine Band played a soft classical arrangement in the corner, the music floating over the gentle clinking of crystal and the hushed, powerful conversations of senators and defense contractors. I took a steadying breath. Admiral Reed had excused himself for just a moment to secure our briefing room, leaving me alone near a towering pyramid of champagne glasses. I reached out to take a flute, appreciating the cold, crisp edge of the crystal against my fingers. I knew the peace would not last. My family never stayed paralyzed for long. They operated on a toxic kind of forward momentum fueled entirely by arrogance and denial. Before I could even take my first sip, a large hand clamped down hard on my shoulder, spinning me around. Xavier towered over me. My brother-in-law was an imposing man, a highly successful African-American corporate lobbyist who used his striking height and immaculate tailoring to dominate every room he entered. Tonight, however, the polished veneer of his Tom Ford suit was betrayed by a frantic energy. A thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead, and his jaw was clenched so tightly, a muscle twitched near his ear. He backed me up against the linen-draped table, holding the champagne tower, using his broad shoulders to block me from the view of the other guests. He leaned down, invading my personal space, his cologne heavy and suffocating. "I do not know who you bribed or what kind of fake government connections you fabricated to get that little scanning trick to work at the gate." Xavier hissed, his voice a low, venomous rumble. "But you need to understand something right now, Caroline. You are playing a very dangerous game in a league you do not belong in. This is the big leagues. I have spent 2 years greasing the right palms and setting up this exact evening. I am walking out of this building tonight with a $100 million defense contract for Pierce Logistics. You are going to stand in the corner, keep your mouth shut, and not do a single thing to sabotage my deal." I looked up at him, entirely unmoved by his physical intimidation. 5 years ago, his towering presence and aggressive tone might have made me shrink away. I would have lowered my eyes, apologized for simply existing, and scurried off to hide in the restroom just to keep the peace. But I was no longer the scapegoat daughter they could bully into submission. I stood my ground, holding his furious gaze with absolute calm. "Your deal relies on a stable product, Xavier," I replied evenly, not bothering to lower my voice. "And we both know Pierce Logistics does not have one." His eyes flashed with pure rage. You know absolutely nothing about corporate logistics, he spat out, pointing a long finger right in my face. You sit behind a computer screen writing useless code while the real adults run the world. You owe this family your absolute silence, Caroline. Do not pretend you have forgotten who keeps this family afloat. I bailed out your sister Beatrice when her ridiculous boutique went bankrupt. I saved her from total financial ruin with the $50,000 your parents took from your college fund 8 years ago. The words were meant to crush me, to remind me of my lowest point. But instead, they just confirmed everything I had always known about their financial abuse. I remembered that day vividly. I had worked 3 grueling jobs, saving every single dollar to pay for my senior year tuition, only to wake up and find my bank account completely drained. My father had forged my signature on a joint account withdrawal. When I confronted them, my mother had simply laughed, telling me that Beatrice needed the money more to launch her business, and that a girl like me did not need a fancy degree to fix computers. They had stolen my future to fund my sister's vanity project, a project that failed entirely in less than a year. And now Xavier was standing in the White House bragging about using my stolen money to clean up his wife's mess, demanding my loyalty as a reward. You owe us your silence, Xavier repeated, leaning in even closer, his eyes dark with desperate menace. You are going to smile, nod, and play the good little supportive sister while I secure this contract. Because if Pierce Logistics goes down, your parents lose their estate, Beatrice loses her credit cards, and you lose the only family you have left. Do you understand me? I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne, letting the cold liquid soothe my throat. I lowered the glass and reached up with my free hand, calmly adjusting the silver cufflink on my crisp white blazer. I looked at the frantic, sweating man trying to bully me, and I felt nothing but clinical pity. I understand perfectly, Xavier. I said, my voice smooth and razor-sharp. I understand that you are standing in a room full of 4-star generals, desperately trying to sell them a logistics software package that crashes every time it handles more than a terabyte of encrypted data. I understand that Pierce Logistics is drowning in debt, and you are using this $100 million contract as a final desperate life raft to save your own sinking career. Xavier stiffened. His hand dropped from my shoulder. A flicker of genuine panic crossed his features, replacing the aggressive anger from just moments before. How do you know about the software crashes? He demanded, his voice suddenly lacking its booming confidence. That is internal company data. I know everything about the software you are pitching tonight, Xavier. I stepped forward, forcing him to take a half step back to maintain his balance. The power dynamic shifted instantly. I was no longer cornered. I was the one backing him into a wall. The code is a complete disaster. It is full of security patches that a first-year programming student could bypass in 5 minutes. You are trying to sell a compromised system to the United States military. You are bluffing, he stammered frantically, glancing around the room to see if anyone was listening to our conversation. You are just trying to get in my head because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of Beatrice and me. You cannot stop this contract. The board is already primed to approve it. I have the votes. I took another slow sip of my drink, savoring the absolute terror radiating from his rigid posture. I leaned in close, bringing my face just inches from his ear, ensuring my next words would land with devastating precision. Did you really think the Pentagon would approve a $100 million defense contract without running a deep forensic background check on your offshore bank accounts, Xavier? He stopped breathing. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face, leaving his skin a pale ashen gray. His eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror as the reality of my words struck him. He opened his mouth to speak, to deny it, to threaten me again, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed, trapped in the terrifying realization that his darkest, most carefully hidden financial secrets were no longer secret at all. Xavier remained trapped in his own nightmare. The blood had entirely left his face. Before he could recover enough to utter a single word of defense, the sharp click of designer heels echoed against the marble floor. Beatrice stormed toward us. She had been watching from across the champagne tower, her eyes narrowed, sensing that her husband was losing whatever battle he had initiated. She carried a full glass of dark Cabernet Sauvignon, her knuckles white around the crystal stem. "What exactly did you just say to him?" Beatrice demanded, her voice a low hiss. She positioned herself between Xavier and me, her perfectly manicured hand resting defensively on his chest. "He is sweating, Caroline. Whatever malicious lies you are spinning, you need to stop right now." I did not back away. I kept my gaze fixed firmly on Xavier, letting him feel the full weight of my leverage. "I am simply giving your husband a friendly reminder about federal auditing procedures," Beatrice, I replied evenly. "It is standard protocol for $100 million contract. Surely a man of his immense caliber has nothing to hide." Xavier swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he remained completely mute. Beatrice looked from him to me, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a mask of pure rage. She despised being ignored, and she absolutely loathed when she could not control the narrative. If she could not intimidate me with her words, she would resort to the exact same petty tactics she had used since we were teenagers. She took a sudden, aggressive step forward. She feigned a stumble, her ankle twisting in an exaggerated motion. With a sharp flick of her wrist, she launched the entire contents of her wineglass directly at my chest. The dark red liquid splashed heavily against my custom-tailored white blazer, soaking through the expensive fabric and blooming into a massive, undeniable stain across my lapel. "Oh my goodness!" Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in a flawless performance of shock. "I am so sorry. Someone bumped into me. There was no one within 3 feet of her." Before the last drop of wine even hit the floor, my mother materialized from the crowd. Catherine rushed over with frantic energy, completely ignoring my ruined clothing. Instead of checking to see if I was all right, she immediately grabbed a linen cocktail napkin from a passing waiter and began dabbing at a single microscopic drop of wine that had landed on Beatrice's diamond bracelet. "Are you all right, darling?" Catherine cooed to my sister, her voice dripping with maternal concern. "Did any of it get on your gown?" "I am fine, Mom." Beatrice sighed, casting a disgusted look at my stained blazer. "But look at what Caroline made me do." She startled me with her aggressive behavior. Catherine finally turned her attention to me, and the maternal warmth instantly vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, familiar disdain. She looked at the red wine dripping from my lapel and sneered. "You always were clumsy, Caroline. You have absolutely no spatial awareness. Why cannot you be graceful like your sister? You have completely ruined your outfit, and you are making a scene in front of Xavier's colleagues. Go hide in the bathroom immediately before anyone important sees you looking like a disaster." The sheer audacity of her reaction was staggering, yet entirely predictable. It was a perfect mirror of my entire childhood. If Beatrice broke a vase, I was scolded for leaving it too close to the edge of the table. If Beatrice failed a class, I was punished for not tutoring her properly. My mother had spent 34 years treating me as the designated shield for my sister's spectacular failures. Tonight was supposed to be no different. They expected me to lower my head, absorb the humiliation and run away in shame so they could resume their glorious evening. Xavier seemed to recover a fraction of his confidence, emboldened by the arrival of his wife and mother-in-law. He adjusted his suit jacket and glared down at me. "You heard your mother, Caroline," he said, his voice regaining some of its deep, booming resonance. "Go clean yourself up. You do not belong out here with us." I stood perfectly still. The wine felt cold against my skin, but my heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic calm. I did not raise my hands to cover the stain. I did not look down in shame. I simply raised my chin and made direct eye contact with the Secret Service agent positioned near the grand staircase. He had been watching the entire exchange. I gave him a single subtle nod. He tapped the earpiece coiled around his ear and whispered something into his wrist microphone. "What are you waiting for?" Catherine snapped, stepping closer and waving her hand in a shooing motion. "Get out of the foyer. You look pathetic." I ignored her entirely. Less than 15 seconds after my signal, the heavy mahogany doors of the VIP corridor opened. A White House protocol officer emerged. He was a distinguished man in a pristine tuxedo, moving with a brisk, undeniable authority that caused the surrounding crowd of politicians and generals to instinctively part ways for him. He carried a sleek black garment bag draped over his forearm. He walked straight past the bewildered faces of my family and stopped directly in front of me. He offered a respectful bow of his head. "Ms. Pierce," he said smoothly, his tone respectful and urgent. "We noticed the incident on the security feeds. The Chief of Staff insisted we provide an immediate replacement so your evening is not interrupted." The officer unzipped the garment bag with practiced efficiency. He pulled out a stunning, immaculate white blazer. It was cut from a fabric far superior to my original jacket, and pinned to the left lapel was a small, understated but unmistakable presidential seal. My mother stopped breathing. Her hand, still holding the crumpled cocktail napkin, fell limply to her side. Beatrice stared at the presidential seal as if it were a physical blow to the face. The protocol officer gently helped me slip out of the ruined jacket, handing it to a nearby staff member who whisked it away like hazardous waste. He then held up the pristine replacement, waiting patiently as I slid my arms into the sleeves. It fit perfectly. Xavier took a hesitant step backward, his eyes darting wildly between the protocol officer and the presidential seal gleaming on my chest. The smug satisfaction had entirely vanished from his face, replaced once again by that suffocating primal terror. He was beginning to realize the true magnitude of the power I commanded in this room. Catherine finally found her voice, though it was nothing more than a breathless, trembling squeak. "Excuse me," she stammered, stepping toward the protocol officer. "There must be some kind of mistake. She is just Caroline. She does not need a jacket from the Chief of Staff." The protocol officer did not even acknowledge my mother's existence. He did not look at her, and he did not respond to her. He kept his attention focused entirely on me, smoothing the collar of my new jacket to ensure it sat perfectly against my neck. He then took a half step back, offering me a warm, professional smile. He pitched his voice perfectly, ensuring that the surrounding crowd of Washington elites, the four-star generals, the defense contractors, and the eager press corps standing near the perimeter could hear every single word he said next. "The Vice President requested you join him at the head table, Ms. Pierce. Shall we?" The protocol officer's words hung in the air, echoing across the marble foyer like a perfectly struck bell. "The Vice President requested you join him at the head table, Ms. Pierce. Shall we?" I nodded to the officer, my movements smooth and deliberate. "I would be honored," I replied, not sparing a single glance at my mother or sister as they stood frozen in their own pathetic humiliation. I turned my back on them and began to follow the protocol officer down the grand hallway leading toward the East Room. The heavy double doors loomed ahead, guarded by Marines in immaculate dress uniform. The corridor was quieter here, away from the clinking glasses and desperate networking of the main lobby. Portraits of past presidents stared down from the crimson walls, watching silently. As I walked toward a seat of power my family could only ever dream of touching. I was steps away from entering the inner sanctum of the evening's elite when a heavy, desperate hand clamped down violently on my bicep, jerking me to a sudden and painful halt. The grip was bruising the fingers, digging sharply into my arm through the pristine fabric of my new blazer. I spun around to face my attacker. My father, Richard Pierce, was breathing heavily, his face flushed with a dark mottled rage. The polished, untouchable CEO facade he wore for the financial press had completely shattered. He looked like a cornered animal, furious and humiliated that the daughter he had spent 3 decades treating like dirt was suddenly commanding the respect of the second most powerful man in the country. He had chased me down the hall, unable to accept that he was no longer in control. The protocol officer stopped immediately, his expression hardening as he assessed the physical threat. He took a half step toward us, a silent and highly trained warning, but I held up my free hand. "Give me 1 moment, please," I told him, keeping my voice steady. The officer nodded curtly, maintaining his vigilant stance just a few feet away, ready to summon the Secret Service at a moment's notice. I turned my attention back to the man actively trying to crush my arm. "Let go of me, Richard," I said, making sure my tone was ice-cold and uncompromising. He did not loosen his grip. Instead, he yanked me slightly closer into the shadows of a marble alcove, his breath smelling sharp with expensive scotch and raw, unfiltered panic. "You are going to listen to me, Caroline." He snarled, his voice a harsh, frantic whisper that echoed off the polished stone. "You are not going to walk into that room and parade around with the vice president while your own family is sidelined like common trash. You are going to take Xavier with you to that head table. You are going to introduce him directly to the vice president right now, and you are going to personally endorse the Pierce Logistics contract to the Joint Chiefs. You are going to make them sign that paperwork tonight." I stared at him, genuinely marveling at the staggering depths of his delusion. "And why would I ever do that?" "Because I am your father," he barked, his face twisting into an ugly, entitled sneer. "Because you owe this family everything you have. I built Pierce Logistics from the ground up with my bare hands. I poured my blood and sweat into creating a legacy while you sat in your bedroom playing with computers like a child. I paid for your food, I paid for your clothes, I put a roof over your head. And if you do not do exactly what I say right now, I will wipe you out completely. I will call my lawyers the second we leave this building and have you cut entirely out of your grandfather's legacy trust fund. You will not see a single dime of that money. You will be dead to this family permanently and forever." His threat echoed in the narrow alcove. It was the exact same weapon he had used to control and manipulate me my entire life. When I wanted to study advanced cybersecurity instead of corporate finance, he threatened to cut me off. When I refused to give Beatrice the credit for my high school coding projects, he threatened to cut me off. The legacy trust fund established by his own father, my grandfather, was the ultimate heavy chain he kept wrapped tightly around my neck. He used it to enforce absolute loyalty, demanding that I constantly sacrifice my own ambitions to prop up his golden child and stroke his fragile, massive ego. He genuinely believed that because he supposedly controlled the purse strings, he owned my entire existence. He thought my silence could be bought, and my compliance could be forced by simply dangling my own inheritance just out of reach. I looked down at the large hand still bruising my arm. Then I looked back up into his desperate, furious eyes. I did not scream. I did not shrink away. With slow, deliberate force, I reached up and pried his thick fingers off my bicep, peeling them back one by one. He tried to resist, trying to reassert his physical dominance, but the sheer, unyielding coldness in my eyes made him falter. He dropped his hand, taking a slight, involuntary step back, realizing for the very first time that physical intimidation no longer worked on me. "You always loved throwing that trust fund in my face, Richard," I said, my voice dead calm and perfectly even. "You loved holding it over me, pretending it made you a powerful god in this family. You wielded it like a weapon to keep everyone exactly where you wanted them." I reached into the inner pocket of my new blazer. My fingers closed around a cold, smooth object. I pulled it out and held it up between us. It was a miniaturized military-grade encrypted drive, no bigger than a thumbnail, but it held enough meticulously gathered data to topple entire corporate empires and send powerful men to federal prison for decades. I rolled it slowly between my fingers, letting the dim golden light of the hallway catch its metallic edge. My father stared at the small drive, his thick brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What is that?" he demanded, attempting to regain his blustering, authoritative tone. "Another one of your little tech toys. Put that garbage away and answer me, Caroline. Are you going to walk in there and introduce Xavier to the vice president or not?" I stepped closer to him, deliberately eliminating the small space he had just created. I wanted him to feel my presence. I wanted him to hear every single syllable with crystal clarity, with no room for misinterpretation. "You did not build Pierce Logistics from the ground up," Richard first whispered, my voice dripping with absolute freezing contempt. "You inherited a struggling company and immediately drove it straight into the ground with your terrible investments, your lack of vision, and your massive unearned ego. You did not build a single thing. You leveraged Grandpa's trust fund to avoid total bankruptcy. You illegally borrowed against the principal balance to keep up your lavish fake lifestyle and to fund Beatrice's endless, ridiculous shopping sprees." The color vanished entirely from his face. His mouth opened, but the blustering demands died instantly in his throat. He looked at the encrypted drive in my hand, then back up to my face, a new profound terror dawning in his wide eyes. He suddenly looked like a very old, very frightened man. Speaking of which, I continued leaning in just a fraction closer, delivering the final devastating blow with surgical precision. The trust fund has been completely empty for 3 years. Every single account drained dry. There is nothing left to cut me out of. I know this for an absolute fact, Richard, because my cybersecurity firm was specifically hired by the Federal Banking Commission to track the missing $5 million. Richard stammered, his jaw working uselessly as he tried to form a coherent sentence. The aggressive crimson flush that had dominated his face just seconds ago vanished entirely, replaced by a sickly, translucent white. He looked as though the polished marble floor of the White House had suddenly opened up beneath his expensive Italian loafers. His eyes darted from my face to the encrypted drive in my hand, completely unable to process how the daughter he had dismissed as a basement-dwelling failure was suddenly holding the absolute destruction of his entire empire. "You are lying?" Richard finally hissed, his voice trembling with a chaotic mixture of raw panic and rising fury. "This is slander, Caroline. This is absolute malicious slander. I will sue you for every single penny you claim to have. If your little firm actually accessed my private accounts, that is illegal hacking. I will have you thrown in federal prison for corporate espionage. You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with. I will destroy you." His threats were entirely hollow, the desperate flailing of a man realizing the foundation of his pristine society life was built on quicksand. Before I could even respond to his pathetic legal posturing, a sharp, ragged gasp echoed off the stone walls of the alcove. My mother. Catherine had followed us down the hall. She stood frozen just a few feet away, her hands clutching the silk fabric of her designer evening gown as if holding onto it for dear life. Her eyes darted wildly between my father and the tiny metallic drive in my hand. She had chased after us to ensure Richard put me in my place, only to walk directly into the implosion of her false reality. "Richard." Catherine choked out, her voice pitching into a hysterical frequency that grated against the quiet elegance of the corridor. "Richard, tell me she is lying right now. Tell me the trust fund is intact. The Hampton House mortgage is due next week, and we just booked the yacht for the summer gala. The country club dues are pending. Tell me we are not broke. You promised me we were fine." "Shut up, Catherine!" Richard snapped, completely dropping his polished society husband facade. He lunged forward again, pointing a trembling, sweaty finger directly at my face. "Give me that drive right now, Caroline. You are a delusional, vindictive little girl playing games you do not understand. You are trying to tear this family apart out of pure spite." "I understand perfectly," I countered, standing my ground as he invaded my personal space. My voice remained completely devoid of emotion. "I understand exactly how a multi-million-dollar legacy vanishes into thin air. Would you like me to recite the transaction history for Mother right here in the hallway? Would you like her to know exactly how you prioritized your golden child and your desperate son-in-law over your own financial survival?" Catherine took a staggering step forward, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently. "What transactions, Caroline? What on earth are you talking about? What did he do?" I kept my eyes locked entirely onto my father's terrified gaze as I laid out the exact forensic accounting trail my team had meticulously mapped out months ago. I did not blink as I dismantled their entire lives. $2 million, I said, my voice echoing with clinical precision. $2 million wired directly from the primary trust fund into Beatrice's offshore accounts over the last 36 months. That money did not just fund her failed boutique mother. It paid for her custom wardrobe, her weekly shopping trips to Paris, and the luxury lease on the penthouse she pretends her husband pays for out of his own pocket. Richard drained the family legacy so Beatrice could play pretend on social media and maintain the illusion of being a successful, self-made woman. Catherine let out a whimpering sob, her knees buckling slightly as the reality of her impending social ruin set in. She leaned heavily against the marble wall, her face draining of color. But I was not finished. And the remaining 3 million, I asked rhetorically, turning my glare back to Richard, who was now sweating profusely through his stiff collar. That went directly into a shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands, a corporation entirely controlled by your brilliant, charismatic son-in-law, Xavier. Richard did not just give him that money as an investment. He used your father's trust fund to cover up Xavier's failed lobbying bribes right here in Washington. Xavier greased the palms of the wrong politicians, completely failed to secure the federal contracts he promised, and needed $3 million in untraceable cash to bury the evidence before the ethics committee caught wind of his illegal kickbacks. You bankrupted the family to keep Xavier out of federal prison. Richard let out a guttural sound of pure, unhinged rage. The carefully maintained illusion of the Pierce family wealth, their perceived superiority, and their flawless social standing was completely dead. I had just presented him with the undeniable autopsy report. He was entirely broke, heavily implicated in federal bribery cover-ups, and the daughter he had treated like a worthless stepping stone for 34 years was holding the absolute proof in the palm of her hand. He completely lost his mind. The remaining shreds of his corporate restraint snapped under the weight of his absolute exposure. He raised his right hand, his face twisting into a horrific mask of pure violence. He was going to strike me right there in the halls of the White House, fully prepared to physically punish the lifelong scapegoat who had finally refused to take the blame for his catastrophic failures. I did not flinch. I did not raise my arms to block him. I simply watched his hand arc backward, knowing with absolute certainty that he would never make contact. Before Richard could swing his hand forward, a massive, heavily decorated arm shot out from the shadows of the corridor. A large, calloused hand clamped down over Richard's shoulder with the force of an industrial vice grip. The momentum of my father's impending strike was halted instantly, jerking his entire body backward with brutal efficiency. Richard let out a sharp cry of shock and pain, stumbling clumsily as he was forcibly turned around to face the man who had just intercepted his assault. Admiral Jonathan Reed stood towering over my father. The Admiral's face was carved from granite, his jaw set in a line of absolute, terrifying military authority. The two Secret Service agents who had been flanking the hallway had closed the distance in mere seconds, their hands hovering dangerously near their holstered weapons, waiting for a single command from the high-ranking leader. My father withered under the Admiral's intense, imposing glare. All the blustering arrogance, the violent entitlement, and the patriarchal superiority vanished in a single instant. Richard suddenly realized he was not in his private corporate boardroom shouting at fearful subordinates. He was standing in the most secure building in the free world, attempting to physically assault a woman right in front of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Reed tightened his grip on Richard's shoulder, his fingers digging deeply into the expensive fabric of my father's tuxedo jacket. The Admiral's voice was not loud, but it carried a chilling, lethal weight that demanded absolute submission. I suggest you keep your hands off the Defense Department's top civilian contractor, Mr. Pierce, before I have you arrested for assaulting a federal official. Richard stumbled backward, the blood rushing from his extremities as Admiral Reed's words registered. The imposing CEO, a man who had built his entire identity on terrifying subordinates and dominating boardrooms, was suddenly nothing more than a terrified, fragile old man shrinking under the weight of genuine federal authority. He opened his mouth desperately, trying to formulate an apology, to backpedal, to offer some pathetic face-saving justification, but the words died in his throat. Admiral Reed simply turned his back on him, dismissing him entirely as if he were an annoying pest. I calmly adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white blazer, offered the Admiral a brief nod of gratitude, and let the protocol officer lead me away. I did not look back at my parents, leaving them to suffocate in the dark alcove with the ruins of their fabricated legacy. The heavy, towering double doors of the East Room swung open, welcoming me into the true center of Washington power. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, warm glow over the meticulously arranged tables. Silverware clinked softly over the low murmur of power brokers, making deals that would shape global economies. I was escorted directly to the front of the room, bypassing dozens of influential figures until I reached my assigned seat at the center of the head table. To my left sat the Vice President of the United States. To my right, the Secretary of Defense. I took my seat, allowing a waiter to immediately pour a fresh glass of sparkling water and cast my gaze out over the vast sea of attendees. From my elevated vantage point, I had a perfect unobstructed view of the entire ballroom, including the far back corner. My family had been herded by security to table 47. It was a wobbly, unadorned circle shoved unceremoniously against the swinging wooden doors of the kitchen service entrance. Every time a waiter passed through the doors would bang precariously close to my father's chair. Even over the ambient noise of the ballroom, I could easily spot Beatrice making an embarrassing scene. She was aggressively waving a manicured hand at a passing waiter, her face contorted in an ugly, entitled scowl. I watched her point frantically toward the front of the room, her lips forming angry, venomous words. She was loudly complaining to anyone forced to listen that the seating arrangements were completely unacceptable. She hissed to her table mates that her spiteful, jealous sister had deliberately manipulated the event staff to ruin her evening out of pure, bitter resentment. It was a masterpiece of chronic delusion. Rather than confronting the terrifying reality that her husband was facing federal prison and her father had completely bankrupted their estate, Beatrice was throwing a tantrum about being seated near the busing station. In her mind, she was perpetually the victim, forever sabotaged by the sibling she deemed beneath her. She possessed a chronic inability to take accountability for her own life, choosing instead to focus her rage on a perceived slight regarding a dinner table. Beside her, Xavier was in a completely different state of mind. He was barely holding himself together. He sat rigidly in his chair, constantly dabbing a damp linen napkin across his profusely sweating forehead. His impeccably tailored Tom Ford suit now looked like a suffocating straitjacket. He kept glancing nervously at the podium at the front of the room, his foot tapping a frantic rhythm against the floorboards. Xavier was sweating bullets because he desperately needed this $100 million logistics contract. It was his final desperate ticket out of the massive illegal debt hole he had dug for himself. If he failed to secure this deal tonight, his Cayman Island accounts would be seized, his lobbying firm would be federally audited, and his entire life would collapse into a prison sentence. The clinking of silverware gradually slowed as the vice president stood to deliver his opening remarks. The room fell into a respectful silence as he spoke about national security innovation and the future of military logistics. He eventually transitioned to the business portion of the gala, announcing the presentations for the upcoming defense supply chain overhaul. Xavier Washington was called to the podium. I watched my brother-in-law slowly rise from his seat near the kitchen doors and make the long, agonizing walk to the front of the room. As he gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, a remarkable transformation occurred. The frantic, sweating, terrified man from the hallway vanished, replaced entirely by the slick, charismatic corporate lobbyist who had charmed his way into Washington's elite circles. Survival instinct and muscle memory took over. He flashed a brilliant, confident smile that reached every corner of the room, projecting an aura of absolute dominance. For 3 uninterrupted minutes, Xavier delivered a masterclass in pure deception. He pitched Pierce Logistics' new encrypted tracking software as a revolutionary breakthrough in military supply chain management. He spoke smoothly and passionately about impenetrable firewalls, seamless global integration, and a flawless data security protocol that would guarantee the absolute safety of American troops deployed abroad. He used all the right buzzwords, hitting every emotional and strategic note with perfect practiced cadence. He claimed the software could handle unlimited terabytes of encrypted data without a single glitch. It was a flawless magnetic performance. I watched several high-ranking generals nod in genuine approval, entirely captivated by the grand illusion he was weaving. Xavier wrapped up his pitch with a powerful, soaring closing statement about patriotism and logistical dominance. He stepped back from the microphone, taking a deep, steadying breath, as polite, deeply impressed applause rolled through the ballroom. A relieved, triumphant smirk briefly crossed his face as he looked out at the clapping generals. He actually believed he had pulled it off. He thought he had just successfully lied his way out of federal prison. The vice president smiled politely and took the microphone back, adjusting it slightly on the stand. He looked out over the crowd, his gaze lingering briefly on Xavier's triumphant face, before shifting directly to his right. The vice president turned to Caroline on the microphone. Ms. Pierce, as our lead auditor, what is your assessment of Mr. Washington's proposal? The vice president's words echoed through the pristine acoustics of the East Room, cutting through the lingering applause like a physical blade. The warm, congratulatory atmosphere evaporated in an instant. Hundreds of faces shifted simultaneously, turning their attention from the glowing podium at the front of the room directly toward the center of the head table. 4-star generals, influential senators, and global defense contractors stared at me in collective anticipation. I looked at the vice president. He offered a slight encouraging nod and extended his hand, offering me his personal microphone. I pushed my chair back, the sound of the wood scraping against the floorboards amplifying in the sudden breathless quiet. I stood up, smoothing the front of my pristine presidential sealed blazer. From my elevated vantage point, I could see the entire ballroom perfectly. At table 47, shoved against the swinging kitchen doors, Beatrice's jaw had unhinged, her mouth hanging open in an ugly display of absolute shock. Catherine clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes wide with terror, as she realized the daughter she had just banished to the bathroom was standing beside the second most powerful man in the free world. At the podium, Xavier looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His charismatic, victorious smirk melted off his face, replaced by a mask of naked, unadulterated horror. I took the microphone, my grip relaxed and steady. "Thank you, Mr. Vice President," I said, my voice projecting crisp and unwavering across the vast room. "Mr. Washington has just delivered a highly compelling, beautifully rehearsed presentation. He spoke of impenetrable firewalls, seamless global integration, and flawless data security protocols. It sounds like a logistical miracle perfectly designed for the modern military." I paused, letting the silence stretch tightly across the ballroom. Unfortunately, I continued, my tone dropping to a clinical razor-sharp edge. That is exactly what it is. A miracle. A complete fantasy entirely detached from the mathematical and structural reality of his software architecture. I began to systematically dismantle his entire 3-minute pitch. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of emotion. True authority never requires shouting. I detailed the fundamental catastrophic flaws embedded deep within Pierce logistics, localized data handling procedures. I recited the specific failing percentages from our preliminary stress tests, quoting exact figures that made the defense contractors in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. I explained with brutal clarity how their proprietary encryption algorithm instantly buckled under the weight of anything exceeding a single terabyte, resulting in a cascading system-wide failure that would leave American troop movements entirely exposed. I watched the generals in the front row stop smiling. The polite interest vanished from their faces. They leaned forward, their brows furrowed in deep concern, whispering urgent commands to their aides, who began scribbling furiously on their notepads. Xavier realized his $100 million lifeline was vaporizing in real time. The panic breached his polished corporate facade. He gripped the edges of the mahogany podium, his knuckles turning stark white, and leaned aggressively into his own microphone. "Now hold on just a minute," Xavier boomed, his deep resonant voice blasting through the PA system, deliberately attempting to drown me out. "I think we need some context here before we jump to any drastic conclusions." It was the exact same intimidation tactic he had deployed against me for the past decade. Every Thanksgiving meal, every Christmas dinner, every single time I had ever tried to speak about my career or assert an opinion, Xavier would simply raise his booming voice and bulldoze right over me. He used his massive physical size and vocal dominance to shrink me, forcing me into submission and silence, while Beatrice smirked in quiet victory from across the table. He fully expected me to yield right now. He expected the old, frightened Caroline to lower her eyes, drop the microphone, and apologize for interrupting the adults in the room. I did not yield. I kept my posture perfectly straight, my eyes locked entirely onto his sweating, desperate face. "My sister-in-law is just an amateur programmer, ladies and gentlemen," Xavier announced, forcing a harsh, condescending laugh that echoed awkwardly in the tense room. He gestured dismissively toward the head table, attempting to strip away my authority by reducing me back to the family scapegoat. She is a hobbyist who occasionally helps our family out with basic IT issues. She certainly does not have the security clearance or the high-level technical expertise to understand the complex military-grade architecture we are discussing tonight. Her assessment is completely misguided and frankly a little embarrassing. He puffed out his chest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He actually believed he had successfully discredited me in front of the Joint Chiefs. I did not bother arguing with his childish insult. I did not defend my credentials. Instead, I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the miniaturized military-grade encrypted drive I had shown my father in the hallway. I caught the eye of the head White House audiovisual technician, who was stationed at a control panel just a few feet away from the head table. I held up the drive and gave him a curt, authoritative nod. The technician did not hesitate. He rushed forward, took the drive from my hand, and plugged it directly into the master's secure terminal. Within seconds, the massive digital projection screen hanging behind Xavier flickered. The sleek corporate Pierce Logistics logo vanished entirely. In its place, a dense scrolling wall of raw source code illuminated the ballroom, casting a harsh, unforgiving blue glow over Xavier's rigid shoulders. I pointed directly at the massive screen. A specific, deeply buried section of the code was highlighted in glaring crimson red for everyone in the room to see. I raised the microphone back to my lips, my voice slicing through the absolute suffocating silence of the East Room. Amateur enough to find the Trojan virus you embedded in the code, Xavier. A virus that redirects military supply routes straight to unauthorized foreign servers. The massive digital projection screen hanging behind the podium bathed the entire East Room in a harsh, unforgiving blue light. The dense wall of raw source code continued to scroll relentlessly, the severe backdoor vulnerability flashing in glaring crimson red. For 5 excruciating seconds, the ballroom was trapped in an absolute suffocating silence. Then the reality of my words registered. The 4-star general seated in the front row stood up abruptly, his chair scraping violently against the polished floorboards. He signaled sharply to the military police stationed at the heavy oak doors. The vice president lowered his microphone, his expression hardening into a mask of pure granite, and took a deliberate, calculated step backward, physically distancing himself from Xavier. The political elite in the room instantly recognized proximity to political death. A wave of agitated, horrified murmurs swept through the crowd as senators and defense contractors actively recoiled from the stage. Xavier stammers into his microphone, attempting to formulate a defense, but the White House sound engineer had already cut his audio. He tapped the dead metal grate of the mic, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a suffocating fish pulled from the water. He looked frantically toward the back of the room, his eyes wide and wild, desperately seeking his usual rescuer. Richard Pierce was already moving. I watched from my seat at the head table as my father practically vaulted out of his chair at table 47. He shoved past Beatrice with such reckless force that he knocked her half-empty wine glass directly into her lap, entirely ignoring her shrill gasp of indignation. Richard's mind was a frantic, terrified calculator, desperately tallying the imminent federal indictments dropping onto his head. Intellectual property theft, federal espionage, treason against the United States military. Pierce Logistics was no longer just a failing enterprise. It was officially radioactive waste. Richard stormed down the center aisle, his heavy footsteps thudding against the floor. He was a man deeply accustomed to sacrificing absolutely anyone to save his own skin, and his survival instincts had entirely taken over. He reached the stage just as 2 stern-faced Secret Service agents stepped forward, placing their heavy hands firmly on Xavier's trembling shoulders. "Get your hands off my company!" Richard bellowed, his voice raw with manufactured righteous fury. He ignored his son-in-law entirely and turned directly to the vice president, pressing his hands together in a pathetic, theatrical display of pleading. "Mr. Vice President, I assure you I had absolutely no idea about any of this. This man operated entirely as a rogue agent. He deceived my board of directors, and he deceived me. Richard then spun around, turning his wrath fully onto Xavier. He lunged forward and violently grabbed his son-in-law by the lapels of his ruined, sweat-soaked Tom Ford suit. "You told me this code was clean," Richard roared, shaking the taller man with surprising force. "I put my company's name on this." I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my sparkling water, watching the performance with clinical detachment. It was the exact same pathetic maneuver I had watched him execute for my entire life. When his highly leveraged real estate investments completely tanked a decade ago, he publicly fired his entire accounting department, ruining their careers to shield his own glaring incompetence. When a Pierce Logistics shipping vessel sank in the Atlantic due to his direct refusal to pay for basic structural maintenance, he blamed the underpaid captain for negligence. Richard Pierce never took the fall. He always found a convenient body to throw onto the tracks to stop the train. Tonight that body was Xavier. "You swore to me the architecture was secure, you lying parasite," Richard spat his face inches from Xavier's. "You used my pristine corporate reputation to peddle your stolen, compromised garbage to the United States military. You have ruined the Pierce family name. You are entirely on your own." The polished, silver-tongued corporate lobbyist shattered completely. The cornered animal inside Xavier finally bit back. Xavier did not cower. He violently shoved Richard backward. My father stumbled hard, his expensive Italian loafers slipping on the polished wood of the stage. He wheeled his arms wildly, barely catching his balance before pitching backward off the elevated platform. "Your pristine corporate reputation," Xavier sneered, his voice echoing across the cavernous room, unamplified, but fueled by pure desperate adrenaline. "Do not make me vomit, Richard." The generals stopped whispering. The Secret Service agents paused their advance, stepping back just an inch, allowing the spectacular implosion to happen. They were gathering every single piece of evidence being voluntarily screamed from the stage. "Pierce Logistics was a rotting corpse long before I married into your pathetic family," Xavier snarled, taking a menacing aggressive step toward my father. "You were bleeding millions every single quarter. You were drowning. You ordered me to find a cheap off-the-shelf logistics solution and slap the Pierce logo on it. You explicitly demanded I cut every single security corner to save capital because you were 2 weeks away from filing Chapter 11 bankruptcy." Richard's face went completely ashen. He held up his trembling hands, shaking his head frantically at the vice president and the staring generals. "He is lying," Richard stammered, his voice cracking. "He is a desperate criminal saying anything to save himself. Do not listen to him." "I warned you the offshore servers were vulnerable," Xavier continued, his voice rising into a furious shout, entirely ignoring my father's weak denials. "I told you the back door was a massive federal risk. I brought you the vulnerability report myself. You looked me dead in the eye, handed it back to me, and told me to bury the paperwork. You signed off on every single compromised line of code on that screen." Xavier threw his head back and let out a harsh, manic bark of laughter. It was a terrifying, completely unhinged sound that bounced off the crystal chandeliers and sent a visible shudder through the crowd. He pointed a long, trembling finger directly at Richard's chest, his eyes burning with pure malice. "Don't play the Saint, Richard. You're the one who forged Caroline's signature to transfer her shares to me in the first place." The absolute silence that had gripped the East Room shattered into a deafening roar. Xavier's confession of federal forgery and corporate conspiracy acted as a match dropped directly into a powder keg. The White House press corps, confined to a designated riser at the very back of the ballroom, erupted into a frenzy of activity. The blinding flashes of high-speed cameras strobed across the room, illuminating the spectacular, devastating collapse of the Pierce family in rapid-fire succession. Journalists shouted questions over the chaos, their voices blending with the outraged murmurs of the military elite. Richard recoiled as if physically struck, his face draining of all remaining color until he resembled a walking corpse. The sheer magnitude of his exposure had finally penetrated his thick skull. He was no longer a respected CEO dealing with a rogue employee. He was a confessed felon implicated in intellectual property theft, federal fraud, and treason, all broadcast live in front of the vice president and the Pentagon's top brass. He lunged at Xavier again, his hands curling into desperate claws, but the Secret Service agents moved with terrifying practiced efficiency. Two agents slammed Xavier face down onto the polished mahogany podium, securing his wrists behind his back with the sharp metallic ratcheting sound of zip ties. Two more agents intercepted my father, grabbing Richard by the arms and dragging him backward. Richard kicked and thrashed his expensive tuxedo jacket, tearing at the seams, screaming obscenities and hurling desperate denials that were entirely swallowed by the deafening noise of the ballroom. From my seat at the head table, I watched the vice president signal to his detail. He stood up, his face a mask of absolute unforgiving disgust, and was immediately escorted out of the room through a secure side door, refusing to spend another second in the presence of my father or my brother-in-law. The four-star generals followed suit, turning their backs on the stage and marching toward the exits, barking orders to their aides to immediately sever all ties with Pierce Logistics and secure their existing data networks. The entire golden facade of my family was burning to ash right in front of my eyes. Suddenly, a shrill, hysterical shriek cut through the chaotic din of the ballroom. "Caroline, fix this right now." I turned my head slightly to see my sister clawing her way through the crowd. Beatrice had abandoned her table by the kitchen doors and was desperately shoving her way past stunned dignitaries and defense contractors. Her carefully constructed high society aesthetic was completely ruined. Her expensive designer gown was twisted around her legs. Her flawless blowout was tangled and messy, and dark streaks of mascara ran heavily down her cheeks, staining her face with cheap theatrical tears. She reached the security perimeter established around the head table and slammed her hands violently against the velvet rope, her eyes wild and completely unhinged. She looked past the Secret Service agents dragging her husband off the stage and focused all of her frantic, desperate energy directly onto me. "Caroline, you have to fix the code!" Beatrice screamed, her voice cracking as she sobbed hysterically. "You are the computer genius. Tell them it was just a glitch. Tell them you made a mistake on your little audit. You have to sign whatever paperwork they need to clear Xavier's name. Tell them he did not know about the virus." I remained seated perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table in front of me. I watched my sister hyperventilate, fascinated by the sheer depth of her delusion. Even now, watching her husband face federal treason charges and her father face ruin, Beatrice fundamentally believed that I existed solely to clean up her messes. She believed I was still the obedient, invisible scapegoat who would happily take the fall to protect her pristine lifestyle. "Do not just sit there looking at me," Beatrice wailed, gripping the velvet rope so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her voice pitched into a frantic, manipulative shriek that echoed off the high ceiling. "We are blood, Caroline. If we go down, you go down. You owe me for covering for you in high school." The absolute absurdity of the statement almost made me laugh. It was her classic, lifelong manipulation tactic. She was referencing an incident from 15 years ago when she had totaled my father's luxury sedan while driving intoxicated. She had forced me to take the blame, convincing our parents I had stolen the keys. I was grounded for a year, completely isolated, while Beatrice was praised for her supposed honesty in coming forward. In her deeply twisted narcissistic reality, she honestly believed that allowing me to take the punishment for her own crime was a tremendous favor she had done for me. She believed I was permanently indebted to her because she had supposedly protected my reputation by taking control of the narrative. I looked at my sister, taking in the ugly, desperate panic twisting her features. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I did not offer a single word of comfort or capitulation. I simply picked up my crystal glass of sparkling water from the table and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cool water felt refreshing against my throat. I set the glass back down on the linen tablecloth with a soft, final clink. I reached into the breast pocket of my white blazer and retrieved a thick, heavily embossed legal document folded neatly into thirds. I unfolded the heavy parchment paper, smoothing it out on the table in front of me. The official seal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission gleamed in the ballroom lights. Beatrice stopped screaming, her breath hitching in her chest as she stared at the official document in my hands. The remaining journalists in the back of the room instantly zoomed their lenses in on the paperwork, the continuous clicking of camera shutters filling the tense silence between us. I looked directly into Beatrice's terrified, mascara-stained eyes. My voice was calm, clinical, and completely devoid of pity. I can't sign over the rights to Pierce Logistics, Beatrice, because as of 9 a.m. this morning, my corporation executed a hostile takeover. Pierce Logistics no longer exists. The absolute silence that followed my declaration hung over the ballroom like a physical weight. Richard staggered backward as if he had been shot. His face, already a sickly translucent white, suddenly flushed with a terrifying mottled purple. He clutched at his chest, his fingers digging into the starched fabric of his tuxedo shirt. For a split second, I thought he might actually drop dead right there on the polished hardwood floor, succumbing to the sheer crushing reality of his absolute defeat. He gasped for air, his eyes bulging wildly as his brain violently rejected the information I had just delivered. "You are lying!" Richard wheezed, his voice reduced to a ragged, desperate rasp. "It is legally impossible. A hostile takeover requires capital, Caroline. It requires hundreds of millions in liquid assets to buy out the majority shareholders. You do not have that kind of leverage. You are a basement-dwelling amateur playing a pathetic, vindictive game." He stepped forward, pushing past the remaining Secret Service agents who were currently focused on hauling Xavier out of the room. The sheer panic in my father's eyes was rapidly morphing back into the vicious, cornered arrogance that had defined his entire life. "You were serving coffee 5 years ago!" Richard shouted, the venom in his voice echoing through the cavernous East Room. His mask of high society restraint was completely obliterated, revealing the ugly, deep-seated misogyny that dictated his every move. "You dropped out of your master's program because you could not handle the pressure. You failed. You are a dropout. So tell me the truth right now. Who is backing you? Who is funding this little revenge fantasy? Which billionaire are you sleeping with to get this kind of money? Because there is absolutely no way a worthless, talentless girl like you pulled this off on your own." A collective gasp rippled through the assembled crowd. Several high-ranking officials exchanged looks of pure disgust. My father was self-destructing in front of the most powerful people in Washington, desperate to attribute my success to the financial backing of a phantom man rather than acknowledge his own daughter's intellect. He would rather believe I was a high-priced escort than a superior business rival. Beatrice, still gripping the velvet rope, nodded frantically in agreement with him, her tear-streaked face twisting into a sneer. "She is bluffing." "Dad," Beatrice shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Make her show you the acquisition papers. She probably printed that off the internet." I did not flinch at their pathetic accusations. I did not raise my voice to defend my honor or explain the grueling, agonizing 80-hour workweeks I had endured to build my software empire from scratch. I simply looked at my father with a cold, hollow smile. The kind of smile a predator gives right before the final strike. "I did not print this off the internet, Richard," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear. "And I am not sleeping with anyone to fund my corporation. I am the funding. But if you refuse to believe me, perhaps you will believe the man who handled the final liquidation of your entire legacy." I turned my gaze slightly to the right, addressing the impeccably dressed silver-haired gentleman sitting 2 seats down from me at the head table. Throughout the entire ordeal, he had remained perfectly still, watching the destruction of the Pierce family with the calm, detached amusement of a seasoned apex predator. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my tone shifting to one of professional command, "would you please clarify the current ownership structure of Pierce Logistics for my former father?" Jonathan Sterling, the highly visible and universally feared face of Vanguard Holdings, stood up from his chair. Vanguard Holdings was the most aggressive, ruthless venture capital firm on the eastern seaboard, renowned for swallowing failing logistics companies whole and stripping them for parts. Richard had spent the last 6 months desperately trying to secure a meeting with Sterling, begging for a bailout loan that Vanguard had repeatedly unceremoniously denied. Seeing Sterling at my table caused the last remaining ounce of fight to drain completely out of my father. Richard's jaw trembled as he looked at the billionaire investor. Jonathan Richard pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. Tell me Vanguard did not finance this hostile takeover. Tell me you did not back her. I practically begged you for a lifeline last quarter. You told me Pierce Logistics was a toxic asset. Why would you fund my daughter's ridiculous vendetta? Sterling did not even look at my father. He ignored Richard's desperate groveling entirely. Instead, the towering, terrifying titan of Wall Street turned to face me. He smoothed the lapels of his custom suit, stepped back from the table, and executed a deep, highly respectful bow directly toward me. It was a gesture of absolute, undeniable submission performed in front of the entire United States military elite. He straightened up and finally cast a look of pure, clinical disdain down at my father. I did not fund your daughter, Mr. Pierce. Sterling announced, his booming voice carrying a lethal, uncompromising weight. I do not make the funding decisions at Vanguard Holdings. I merely execute them. Richard blinked, his mind completely failing to process the words. You are the CEO. Richard stammered, confusion warring with his rising terror. You own Vanguard. Sterling let out a sharp, humorless chuckle, a sound that echoed like a judge's gavel striking the bench. I am the CEO. Sterling corrected, his eyes locking onto Richard with predatory intensity. But I do not own the company. I answer to a board of directors, and ultimately I answer to the majority shareholder. Sterling turned back to me, gesturing with an open palm. I answer to Ms. Pierce. Sterling announced, delivering the final fatal blow to my father's reality. She is the sole founder and 100% owner of Vanguard Holdings. She bought your debts for pennies on the dollar, Mr. Pierce. Sterling's words hung in the air, cold and absolute, acting as the final execution order for the Pierce family empire. Richard gasped, his knees finally buckling under the sheer crushing weight of his absolute ruin. The Secret Service agents did not wait for him to catch his breath or process the magnitude of his defeat. They hauled him upward by his armpits, his custom Italian shoes dragging uselessly across the polished floorboards. He looked back at me one last time, his eyes wide and wild, silently begging for a mercy he had never once shown me during his entire life. I offered him nothing. I did not blink. I did not smile. I simply watched as the heavy oak doors of the East Room swung shut behind him, sealing his fate and ending his tyrannical reign over my life. Beatrice watched our father disappear into federal custody, and the horrifying reality of her new existence suddenly crashed down upon her. The generational wealth she had paraded around like a royal title was completely gone. The private jets she used for weekend shopping trips, the Hamptons Country Club memberships, the sprawling summer estates, the limitless corporate credit cards she used to fund her entire identity, they all belonged to me now. The absolute terror of impending poverty contorted her flawless, surgically enhanced face into something genuinely monstrous. She whipped her head around, her panicked gaze landing on Xavier, who was still pinned against the mahogany podium by the remaining federal agents. Beatrice did not run to her husband to comfort him. She did not defend the man she had vowed to stand beside in sickness and in health. Instead, seeing her vast wealth disappearing into thin air, she turned her wrath entirely onto her husband. She launched herself at the stage like a rabid animal. She bypassed the velvet security rope, scrambled up the wooden steps, and lunged directly at Xavier. The federal agents instinctively braced themselves, but Beatrice ignored them completely, raining frantic, uncoordinated blows down upon her husband's chest and shoulders. Her manicured nails caught the fabric of his ruined Tom Ford suit, tearing the expensive silk as she struck him again and again with surprising, vicious force. You promised me! Beatrice shrieked, the sound tearing through her throat, raw and completely stripped of her usual aristocratic polish. You promised me a life of luxury. You swore this military contract would make us untouchable. Xavier winced, attempting to shield his face with his shoulder, since his hands were tightly bound behind his back with heavy plastic zip ties. Beatrice, stop, he pleaded, his voice cracking with humiliation as the remaining journalists eagerly captured every pathetic second of the domestic violence playing out on the national stage. "We can fix this. We can hire lawyers. We can fight her." "Hire lawyers with what money?" Beatrice wailed, her voice echoing across the cavernous ballroom. She landed a brutal, open-handed slap directly across his cheek. A bright red welt instantly bloomed against his pale, sweating skin. Her chest heaved as she glared down at the man she had married, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated hatred. "I only married you because Dad said you would make me a billionaire. You are useless." The brutal, unapologetic honesty of her confession hung heavy in the air. The clicking of the press cameras seemed to echo 10 times louder in the silence that followed. Xavier stopped struggling against the agents holding him. His head dropped forward, his shoulders slumping, as the absolute shallowness of his entire existence was broadcast to the world. He had sold his soul to the Pierce family. He had committed federal treason and risked decades in a maximum security prison just to fund Beatrice's insatiable vanity. And the very moment the money vanished, she discarded him like useless trash. I watched the pathetic display from my seat, feeling a deep, profound sense of clinical closure. For 30 years, I was told that Beatrice was the ideal. She was the absolute standard of grace, elegance, and success. I was the flawed, defective copy who would never measure up to her radiant perfection. But stripped of my father's stolen money, Beatrice was nothing more than a shallow, desperate parasite, violently turning on her host the exact second the blood supply ran dry. I stood up from the head table, calmly smoothing the lapels of my white blazer. I picked up my leather briefcase, popped the brass clasps, and reached inside. My fingers brushed against the thick, heavy manila envelope I had been carrying around for 3 weeks. I slid it out, feeling the substantial weight of the glossy photographs hidden inside. It was time to finish this. It was time to burn the last remaining illusion of Beatrice's perfect life completely to the ground. I stepped down from the elevated platform and walked slowly down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. Beatrice stopped attacking Xavier and turned to look at me. Her chest was still heaving, her mascara-stained face twisting into a mask of pure venom as she watched my approach. She expected me to gloat. She expected me to rub my newfound billionaire status in her face and demand an apology for decades of torment. I did not say a single word about Vanguard Holdings. I stopped directly in front of her table, the exact table she had abandoned in her frantic rush to the stage. I lifted the thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the center of the linen tablecloth. It landed with a heavy, satisfying slap, knocking over a crystal salt shaker. The metal clasp on the back of the envelope was undone, and a few high-resolution photographs spilled out onto the white fabric. The top photograph clearly showed Xavier walking hand in hand down a Miami beach with a beautiful brunette woman, a laughing toddler riding on his shoulders. Beatrice stared at the envelope, her brow furrowing in deep confusion. She looked from the photographs to me, her breathing shallow and ragged. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a new, distinct type of fear. "More fake documents," I offered her, a cold, empty smile. "Before you mourn your bank accounts. Beatrice, you might want to look at those photos. Xavier hasn't just been stealing code. He's been using Pierce Logistics corporate cards to fund his second family in Miami." Beatrice stared at the glossy photographs scattered across the white linen tablecloth. Her manicured hands hovered over them, trembling so violently, her diamond rings rattled against each other. The images were undeniably clear, captured by a premier private investigator I had retained months ago. There was Xavier, her devoted, brilliant husband, laughing on a sun-drenched deck in South Beach. There he was again, kissing a stunning brunette, outside a boutique in Bal Harbour. And the most damning photo of all, Xavier, lifting a laughing toddler onto his shoulders, carrying shopping bags from stores Beatrice frequented herself, all paid for with the Pierce Logistics corporate black card. The color drained entirely from Beatrice's face. The hysterical, high-pitched screaming that had defined her entire existence abruptly ceased. For the first time in her life, my sister was rendered completely, utterly speechless. She did not cry. She did not shout. She simply went rigid, her eyes wide and hollow, as the absolute totality of her humiliation settled over her. She was not just broke. She was a publicly discarded, universally pitied joke. She slowly lifted her head and looked at Xavier. The charismatic, polished facade of the silver-tongued Washington lobbyist broke completely. The sudden, suffocating silence from his wife was the final sledgehammer to his fragile ego. Xavier had spent his entire career manipulating narratives, talking his way out of corners, and charming his way into high-security clearances. He had always relied on his devastating good looks and his tailored suits to project an aura of untouchable authority. But right now, bound by plastic zip ties, sweating profusely and exposed as a serial fraudster, a traitor, and an adulterer, the mask melted away. He looked wildly around the room. He saw the vice president's empty chair. He saw the furious, disgusted faces of the Pentagon generals. He saw Jonathan Sterling standing respectfully at my side. He saw the flashing cameras of the press corps capturing his total annihilation. Finally, his frantic gaze locked onto me. I was sitting perfectly still, my expression utterly relaxed, watching his destruction with the casual interest of someone observing a predictable science experiment. The contrast between my absolute calm and his total ruin snapped whatever remaining tether Xavier had to sanity. A primal, guttural roar ripped from his throat. It was not the sound of a sophisticated executive. It was the feral, desperate shriek of a cornered animal realizing there was no escape. Using a sudden, violent surge of pure adrenaline, Xavier ripped his shoulders out of the grasp of the two Secret Service agents holding him. Because his hands were bound tightly behind his back, he could not use his arms, but his tall, athletic frame still possessed terrifying momentum. He dropped his head, squared his heavy shoulders, and lunged off the elevated stage directly toward my table. "You arrogant, stuck-up nobody, I'll kill you." His voice was a horrifying, demonic screech that shattered the hushed murmurs of the ballroom. He charged blindly down the center aisle, his expensive leather shoes slipping and sliding frantically against the polished hardwood floor. I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle to defend myself. I sat in my chair and watched him charge, feeling an overwhelming wave of cold, clinical validation wash over my entire body. This was the real Xavier. The entire room was finally witnessing the exact monster I had endured for years. As he hurtled toward me, his face twisted in pure malice, a flood of memories rushed through my mind. I remembered him cornering me in the dimly lit hallway of my parents' estate during a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years ago. I had brought up a minor discrepancy in his software architecture. He had trapped me against the wall, using his massive height to block my escape. His face inches from mine, his breath hot and threatening. He had snarled those exact same words, promising to destroy my career, ruin my reputation, and make my life a living hell if I ever dared to question his authority in front of my father again. Whenever his charm failed to manipulate me, Xavier had always resorted to physical intimidation. He had spent years towering over me, looming in doorways, invading my personal space, and using his physical presence to silence me. My parents had always called me dramatic and crazy whenever I mentioned his aggressive tendencies, claiming I was just jealous of his success. They had gaslit me into believing I was the problem. But tonight, there was no gaslighting. There was no hiding the truth behind closed doors. The Golden Boy was broadcasting his violent, unhinged true nature live on national television. He did not even make it within 5 feet of my table. Before I could even register a threat to my physical safety, the air around me erupted into motion. Admiral Reed, the highest-ranking naval officer in the room, had not evacuated with the vice president. He had remained standing near the front row, his eyes locked on the stage, evaluating the threat level with military precision. The moment Xavier broke free, the Admiral signaled his personal security detail. 3 heavily armed naval security officers intercepted Xavier with breathtaking, brutal efficiency. They did not simply grab him, they collided with him like a freight train hitting a stalled car. One officer drove his shoulder directly into Xavier's midsection, cutting off his forward momentum entirely. The other 2 officers grabbed him by the lapels of his torn jacket and swept his legs out from under him. Xavier hit the solid marble floor of the ballroom with a sickening, heavy thud that rattled the crystal glasses on my table. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. He gasped, his face pressing hard against the cold, unyielding stone, a thin trickle of blood escaping his split lip. The three officers instantly descended upon him, driving their knees into his spine and pinning his legs to the ground, immobilizing him entirely. The press corps went absolutely berserk. The shouting intensified into a deafening roar as journalists frantically documented the spectacular physical takedown of the man who had just attempted to sell compromised software to the United States government. Xavier lay crushed against the marble, gasping for oxygen, his eyes wide with a combination of physical agony and utter disbelief. He was totally paralyzed, unable to move a single inch under the crushing weight of the military officers. Admiral Reed stepped forward. The decorated military veteran moved with slow, deliberate authority, completely unbothered by the chaos raging around him. He stopped right beside the spot where Xavier was pinned to the floor. The Admiral looked down at my brother-in-law, his expression radiating absolute, unforgiving disgust. The room seemed to hold its collective breath as the Admiral leaned over the struggling, bleeding man. "Xavier Washington, your federal security clearance is permanently revoked," Admiral Reed stated, his voice cutting through the noise with chilling clarity. "And I believe the FBI has a few questions for you regarding corporate espionage." Right on cue, 3 men and 2 women wearing unassuming dark suits and severe expressions stepped out from the shadows of the East Room's ornate pillars. Their federal credentials hung prominently from heavy lanyards around their necks. They moved with a terrifying synchronized purpose, parting the sea of stunned defense contractors and panicked politicians without uttering a single word. The naval security officers hauled Xavier to his feet, his nose bleeding sluggishly onto his ruined collar, and shoved him directly into FBI custody. The lead federal agent gripped Xavier's bicep with bone-crushing force, immediately dragging him away from the stage and toward the heavy oak doors. The sharp metallic clatter of the handcuffs securing Xavier seemed to echo across the entire ballroom. That specific sound served as the absolute breaking point for my mother. Catherine Pierce had spent 35 years meticulously curating an image of untouchable aristocratic perfection. She had ruthlessly orchestrated every family dinner, every charity gala, and every strategic marriage to ensure the Pierce name remained synonymous with elite power. Now she was standing in the middle of the White House watching her golden son-in-law being dragged away as a confessed traitor, while her husband stared into the abyss of total financial ruin. The psychological dam holding back her manufactured reality completely shattered. Catherine did not scream at the federal agents. She did not rush to comfort her hyperventilating husband. Instead, she slowly turned her gaze toward the stage, locking her eyes onto her favorite perfect daughter. Beatrice was still frozen on the elevated platform, her chest heaving, her hands covered in the torn silk threads of Xavier's suit. Catherine marched toward the stage, her heavy diamond necklace rattling against her collarbone. Her face, usually a mask of paralyzing Botoxed calm, was twisted into a grotesque portrait of pure, unadulterated rage. She grabbed the velvet security rope, ripped it from its brass stanchion, and threw it violently to the ground. Catherine reached the stage and seized Beatrice by the shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging deeply into her daughter's bare skin. Beatrice let out a startled, pathetic whimper, her eyes wide with shock, as she stared at the woman who had always been her greatest ally. "This is your fault!" Catherine shrieked, the sheer volume of her voice causing the nearby journalists to flinch. Her sophisticated mid-Atlantic accent completely vanished, replaced by the ugly, raw screech of a woman realizing her limitless credit lines had just been permanently severed. "You brought this thug into our family." Beatrice shook her head frantically, fresh tears carving deep rivers through her heavy foundation. "Mom, please, I did not know." Beatrice sobbed, her hands coming up to weakly grasp her mother's wrists. "He lied to me. He lied to all of us. You have to believe me." Catherine shook her daughter with such terrifying violence that Beatrice's diamond earrings whipped against her neck. "Do not play the victim with me." Catherine roared, her spit flying into Beatrice's face. "You swore to us he was a prodigy. You paraded him around the Hamptons like a trophy. You demanded we finance his ridiculous, lavish lifestyle because you absolutely had to have the perfect, powerful husband to show off to your little country club friends. And he is nothing but a common thief who just destroyed my entire life." "Mom, stop!" Beatrice pleaded, her voice breaking into a high-pitched, childlike whine. She desperately clawed at her mother's grip, her polished facade entirely broken. "I am your daughter." Catherine's eyes went completely dead. The conditional, transactional nature of her maternal love was fully, terrifyingly exposed under the glaring lights of the ballroom. She did not see a daughter in pain. She saw a failed investment. She saw a liability. "You were always a massive disappointment." Catherine spat, her voice dripping with pure venom as she shoved Beatrice backward with staggering force. "Just like your sister." I watched the entire exchange from my seat, resting my chin on my folded hands. My heart did not race. My pulse remained entirely steady. I was witnessing the ultimate poetic betrayal. For my entire life, Beatrice had smugly weaponized our mother's affection, using it as a club to beat me into submission. She genuinely believed she was loved because she was inherently valuable. She had never understood that in the Pierce family, love was strictly an accounting metric. Beatrice was only cherished as long as she generated a positive return on investment, as long as she elevated the family's social capital. The very second her golden husband became a federal liability, the very moment the Vanguard Holdings buyout rendered her utterly penniless, Beatrice became an expense our mother was no longer willing to carry. Beatrice stumbled backward, her expensive stilettos catching on the edge of the mahogany podium. She lost her balance entirely and crashed to the floor. She fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably in her ruined designer gown, her face buried in her hands. Her flawless, curated existence had been reduced to absolutely nothing in a matter of minutes. She looked up at our mother, begging for a single ounce of comfort, but Catherine had already turned her back, frantically scanning the room for an exit strategy that no longer existed. I sat back in my chair, feeling the cool, refreshing chill of absolute victory. I watched with icy detachment as the family's toxic foundation crumbled into dust. I had not destroyed them. I had simply handed them the matches, laid out the kindling of their own monumental greed, and watched them set themselves on fire. The heavy, authoritative footsteps of another federal agent broke through Beatrice's pathetic sobbing. The remaining crowd parted once again, creating a wide, empty circle around the man who had orchestrated decades of misery. Richard was still leaning heavily against the head table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps as his brain desperately tried to process the Vanguard buyout. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and terrified, as a tall, imposing FBI agent stopped directly in front of him. The agent reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, the metal clinking ominously in the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. "Richard Pierce," the agent announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy against the United States government." The heavy, authoritative footsteps of another federal agent broke through Beatrice's pathetic sobbing. The remaining crowd parted once again, creating a wide, empty circle around the man who had orchestrated decades of misery. Richard was still leaning heavily against the head table, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps, as his brain desperately tried to process the Vanguard buyout. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and terrified, as a tall, imposing FBI agent stopped directly in front of him. The agent reached to his belt and unclipped a pair of heavy steel handcuffs, the metal clinking ominously in the sudden, suffocating silence of the ballroom. "Richard Pierce," the agent announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy against the United States government." For a fraction of a second, the sheer absurdity of the statement seemed to paralyze my father. He had spent his entire adult life operating under the ironclad belief that billionaires did not get arrested. They paid fines. They settled out of court. They hired armies of corporate litigators to bury government investigations under mountains of paperwork. He stared at the steel cuffs dangling from the agent's hand, as if they were an alien artifact, Then the reality of his total financial ruin caught up with his current physical predicament. Vanguard Holdings owned Pierce Logistics. Vanguard Holdings owned his debt. He no longer had the financial leverage to deploy his army of lawyers. He was entirely, horrifyingly defenseless. "Get your hands off me!" Richard bellowed, his voice cracking violently as the FBI agent reached forward and grabbed his right wrist. The agent did not hesitate. He twisted Richard's arm firmly behind his back with practiced mechanical efficiency. "You cannot do this." Richard screamed, his face turning an alarming volatile shade of crimson. He began to thrash wildly against the mahogany table, sending champagne flutes and silver cutlery crashing to the floor. "I am the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. I demand to speak to my general counsel. I have executive privileges." "Mr. Pierce, stop resisting," the second FBI agent warned, stepping in to seize Richard's left arm. "I will not be treated like a common street criminal." Richard roared, his custom-tailored tuxedo jacket tearing at the seam as he violently jerked his shoulder. "I am a personal friend of the Vice President. I fund congressional campaigns. You are making a monumental mistake. I refuse to be perp. Walked out of the White House. I refuse." The agents ignored his frantic declarations of superiority. They were entirely unimpressed by his wealth, mostly because they knew what the rest of the room now knew. His wealth was gone. The immense invisible shield of capital that had protected him from the consequences of his actions had been stripped away by his own daughter. Richard kicked backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping uselessly against the marble. He looked desperately toward the crowd of military generals, defense contractors, and politicians who had eagerly drunk his champagne just an hour ago. He expected an intervention. He expected someone, anyone, to step forward and use their political capital to halt the humiliation. Instead, the elites of Washington actively shrank away from him. They averted their eyes, whispering to their aides, already calculating how quickly they could scrub Richard Pierce's name from their donor ledgers. He was toxic. He was radioactive. Finding no salvation in the crowd, Richard's wild, desperate gaze snapped toward his wife. Catherine was standing just a few feet away, standing over the sobbing heap of Beatrice. Richard's eyes begged her for intervention, pleading for her to use her legendary social maneuvering to halt the spectacle. Catherine met his eyes for one brief, terrifying second. Her expression was completely devoid of warmth, loyalty, or marital devotion. She looked at the man she had been married to for nearly 4 decades, the man who was currently wrestling with federal agents, and she took a deliberate step backward. She was physically and metaphorically distancing herself from the sinking ship. She would not let his undertow drag her flawless reputation down into the federal prison system. Abandoned by his peers and discarded by his wife, Richard's mind completely snapped. His gaze locked onto me. I was still standing perfectly composed in the center of the aisle, holding the absolute, unwavering authority that he had spent my entire life trying to deny me. I was the architect of this nightmare. I was the sole owner of Vanguard Holdings. In his fractured, panic-stricken mind, he genuinely believed I still owed him the blind, terrified obedience he had conditioned into me since childhood. He believed he could command me to fix the apocalypse he had brought upon himself. "Tell them to stop!" Richard demanded, his voice shredding into a hoarse, desperate shriek. He stopped struggling against the agents just long enough to point a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You tell them this is a corporate misunderstanding. You withdraw the Vanguard acquisition right now." I did not blink. I simply tilted my head, watching the last remnants of his tyrannical power evaporate into the heavily conditioned air of the East Room. "Do you hear me, Caroline?" He shrieked, the spittle flying from his lips as the agents forced his arms closer together. His entitlement was so deeply embedded in his bones that even in the face of federal indictment, he viewed me as his property. "I am still your father. You owe me. I gave you life. Tell them to stop." His words echoed against the crystal chandeliers, dripping with the exact same toxic, aggressive bullying he had used to silence me behind closed doors for years. He genuinely believed the mere title of father granted him absolute immunity from my vengeance. He believed that biology was a blank check he could cash whenever he needed a bailout. I stepped forward. I closed the distance between us with slow, deliberate steps. The federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, sensing the massive shift in the room's energy as I approached the struggling billionaire. I stopped right in front of him, close enough to see the broken blood vessels in his eyes, close enough to smell the sour stench of raw terror radiating from his skin. I looked down at his wrists. The FBI agent clamped the cold steel around his right wrist. The heavy metal clicked shut with a sharp, echoing snap. Then the agent wrenched Richard's left wrist backward, forcing it to meet the right. A second metallic click sealed his fate forever. Richard stared at me, his chest heaving, his entire body trembling, as the physical reality of the handcuffs finally broke his spirit. The man who had controlled global supply chains, who had dictated international shipping routes, who had terrorized his own daughter into submission, was now entirely powerless. I leaned in slightly, maintaining perfect eye contact. I kept my voice incredibly soft, ensuring that only he and the agents holding him could hear the final verdict of his life's work. "You gave me life, Richard, but you spent the next 34 years trying to crush it. Enjoy federal prison. I hear their logistics system is terrible." The FBI agents yanked Richard forward by his pinned arms. My father stumbled, his polished Italian leather shoes scraping harshly against the floorboards as they dragged him away. He twisted his neck, trying to scream one last command, one final desperate order, but his voice broke into a pathetic, wheezing rasp. The heavy oak doors of the East Room swung shut behind him with a resonant, booming thud. The sound echoed across the high ceilings, acting as the final gavel strike on the Pierce family dynasty. The resulting silence in the ballroom was absolute. The military brass, the defense contractors, and the remaining political aides stood completely frozen, staring at the empty space where two of the most powerful men in Washington had just been dismantled and hauled away like common street criminals. At my feet, Beatrice remained crumpled on the marble floor. She was a ruin of torn silk, smeared designer makeup, and hyperventilating sobs. She clutched her arms around her chest, rocking back and forth in a frantic rhythm, entirely incapable of processing the fact that her limitless bank accounts and her golden husband were permanently gone. I looked past my weeping sister and met the gaze of my mother. Catherine Pierce stood entirely still near the abandoned mahogany table. Her diamond necklace caught the light of the chandelier, sparkling brightly against the sudden pallor of her skin. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine, unadulterated terror flashing behind her eyes. Her husband was on his way to federal prison. Her son-in-law was facing charges of high treason. The generational wealth she had worshipped like a religion had been legally annexed by the daughter she had spent decades treating like a defective servant. But my mother was nothing if not a survivor. She was a societal parasite who had always known exactly how to adapt when the environment shifted. I watched her perform a terrifying, seamless psychological pivot right before my eyes. The rigid mask of aristocratic fury melted away. The disgust she had just hurled at Beatrice vanished completely. As Catherine realized that I was now the sole possessor of the Pierce legacy, she calculated her survival strategy with sociopathic speed. If Richard was gone, if Xavier was ruined, if Beatrice was broke, there was only one apex predator left in the room, and Catherine immediately decided to align herself with the winner. She took a step forward, then another. She glided across the hardwood floor, her posture radiating a manufactured, elegant calm. When she reached the spot where Beatrice was sobbing on her knees, Catherine did not stop. She did not kneel to comfort her favorite child. She literally stepped over Beatrice's ruined gown, treating her devastated daughter like a discarded piece of furniture blocking her path. Catherine stopped 2 feet away from me. Her face softened into a masterclass of fabricated affection. A warm, glowing, incredibly proud smile spread across her lips. It was the exact smile she used when posing for Society magazine covers, a smile she had never once directed at me in my entire 34 years of existence. She reached out with both hands, her diamond rings catching the light, and gently stroked my forearm. "Oh, my brilliant, beautiful Caroline!" Catherine cooed, her voice taking on a sweet, loving maternal pitch that made my stomach churn with instant revulsion. "I always knew you were destined for greatness. I was just tough on you to push you. We don't need those men. It's just you and me now, right? The absolute audacity of her revisionist history hung in the air. She was actually trying to rebrand 30 years of systemic psychological abuse as a dedicated parenting strategy. She was trying to claim credit for the empire I had built entirely in the shadows of her neglect. I looked down at her hands resting on my sleeve. I remembered being 7 years old, proudly showing her a perfect report card, only to have her push me away because she was busy selecting Beatrice's pageant dresses. I remembered being 20, calling her in tears from my cramped apartment, hungry and exhausted, only for her to hang up on me because I had chosen a career in logistics over marrying a trust fund heir. She had starved me of affection my entire life, and now she was trying to feast on the billionaire status I had earned without her. I violently brushed her hand off my arm as if she were a venomous snake. Catherine recoiled, her false smile slipping for a fraction of a second before she desperately tried to pin it back into place. "Caroline, darling, please," she whispered, her tone dropping into a pathetic, conspiring register. "You have proven your point. You won. You outsmarted your father, and you ruined Xavier. It was magnificent. But you cannot leave me out in the cold. We are Pierce women. We survive together." I did not offer her a single degree of warmth. I did not raise my voice. I simply turned my head and locked eyes with a young, sharply dressed protocol officer standing near the edge of the stage. He had been briefed precisely on the sequence of events. I gave him a crisp, subtle nod. The officer immediately stepped forward, navigating past the stunned defense contractors, and handed me a sleek black iPad in a leather folio. He bowed his head respectfully and quickly backed away. I tapped the screen, illuminating a heavily documented legal PDF displaying several prominent, unassailable digital signatures. Catherine stared at the glowing screen, her perfectly manicured hands trembling slightly at her sides. "What is that?" she asked, the manufactured sweetness finally draining out of her voice, replaced by a rising tide of genuine panic. I held the screen up, positioning it so she could clearly read the bold capitalized header at the top of the document. "You're right, Mother. We don't need them. But you definitely need this: an eviction notice for the family estate. I sold it to a commercial developer this afternoon. You have 24 hours to pack." The finality of my declaration acted as a catalyst for my mother's complete psychological disintegration. Catherine Pierce, the woman who had spent 4 decades dictating the social calendar of the Eastern Seaboard with an iron fist, collapsed. She did not fall with grace or composure. She folded inward like a marionette, with its strings abruptly severed, her knees hitting the polished hardwood floor with a sharp, sickening crack. She lunged forward, her expensive vintage Chanel skirt bunching up around her thighs as she scrambled across the floor on all fours. Before I could move, she had latched onto my ankles, her hands gripping my pant legs with a desperate, frantic strength that defied her age. She was wailing now, a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated terror as she pressed her face against my shoes, completely abandoning the high society persona that had defined every waking hour of her life. "You can't leave me on the street!" Catherine shrieked, her voice echoing against the vaulted ceiling of the East Room, the sound raw and terrifyingly guttural. "I'm your mother. I carried you. I fed you. I gave you everything." The journalists who had been scrambling toward the exits to file their reports on Richard's arrest spun around in unison. Every single camera lens in the room shifted, turning the most humiliating, pathetic moment of my mother's life into a permanent broadcasted record. I looked down at her. She was a woman reduced to begging, her elaborate hair coming undone, her makeup streaking in ugly dark lines down her cheeks. She was clawing at me, trying to invoke the biological connection she had treated as a non-existent nuisance for my entire life. I pulled away effortlessly. My movements were fluid and cold, lacking even a shred of the hesitation that had paralyzed me when I was younger. I stood over her, looking down at the woman who had spent 34 years measuring my worth against a bank statement, and I felt nothing but the hollow chill of finality. "You fed me scraps while giving Beatrice feasts," I said, my voice projecting across the silent room. I did not raise it yet. Every word cut through the heavy air with surgical precision. "You made your choice years ago. You chose to value Beatrice's vanity over my survival. You chose to treat me like a defective asset rather than a daughter. That bill has finally come due. Beatrice remained on her knees a few feet away, her head bowed, her sobs turning into rhythmic, shuddering gasps. She was a ghost in her own life, having realized that her existence was tied entirely to the wealth I had just legally incinerated. I turned my back on them both. I looked toward the center of the room where the protocol officer was waiting, his expression unreadable. I signaled for him to approach once more. "I do not want to see them again," I said, my voice low and final. "Ensure that the security detail escorts both of them to the east gate immediately. If they attempt to return, if they attempt to contact me, or if they attempt to enter the Pierce estate, I want the full force of the legal system applied to them." The protocol officer nodded, his posture stiffening as he moved to execute my order. As I walked toward the exit, I felt the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the East Room finally lifting. The power, the prestige, the crushing expectation of the Pierce name, it was all dissolving. I walked past the massive ornate portrait of the first president, feeling like I was finally stepping out of a dark, airless tunnel and into the light. My security detail, now under my sole direction, flanked me as I moved toward the main entrance. I could hear Catherine in the background, her voice growing increasingly frantic as the guards reached out to pull her away from the floor. She was calling my name, switching from sobbing pleas to jagged, hateful curses, but the sound was fading with every step I took. I reached the grand foyer where the cold, crisp air of a Washington evening waited just beyond the heavy glass doors. I paused there, letting the silence of the marble hall settle around me. I looked down one final time, not at the physical space behind me, but at the digital notification still glowing on the iPad in my hand, a confirmation that the Pierce family estate had been transferred, the deed cleared, and the eviction notice served. I had systematically dismantled the hierarchy they had used to hold me hostage. I stepped out onto the portico. The night air was biting and sharp, a reminder that the world was vast and indifferent to the wreckage I had left behind in the East Room. I looked back at the glass doors. My mother and sister were being ushered toward the exit, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. They were no longer the figures of terror that had haunted my childhood. They were just two people who had bet everything on a system that no longer existed. At the check-in area when I first arrived, "You said I wasn't invited to your world," I shouted, my voice carrying over the sound of the evening traffic. They both stopped, looking back at me with expressions of dazed, utter ruin. "Well," I said, taking a deep, liberating breath of the cold air, "you're officially uninvited from mine." The sound of Catherine's shrieks bounced off the marble wainscoting as the Secret Service detail moved in. They did not touch her with the gentleness they afforded the other guests. Instead, two agents firmly grasped her by the elbows, their faces expressionless, their movements efficient. Catherine, realizing her social capital was now worth less than the dust on the floor, switched her tactics instantly. She stopped screaming and went entirely limp, a dead weight they were forced to drag across the polished expanse of the East Room. Beatrice fared no better. She was still shivering on the floor, her mind clearly unable to grasp the magnitude of her displacement. When an agent reached down to haul her to her feet, she didn't even protest. She was a hollowed-out shell, the curated perfection of her life, having evaporated the moment the handcuffs snapped around Richard's wrists. They were marched toward the rear of the room, past the gold-leafed portraits and the heavy velvet drapes toward the service corridor. It was the same route the catering staff used to haul away crates of empty wine bottles and bags of rotting refuse. Watching them disappear behind the heavy industrial steel doors, I felt a sharp, crystalline memory cut through the hum of the room. It was Christmas Eve, 6 years ago. I had arrived at the Pierce family estate in Connecticut, tired and hopeful, only to be intercepted by Catherine in the hallway. She had physically blocked my path, her eyes scanning my simple professional attire with a sneer. She told me that Beatrice and Xavier were hosting a private elite dinner for Senator Sterling and his donors, and that my presence would be a social liability. She had directed me to eat in the service kitchen with the hired help, ensuring I wouldn't distract from Beatrice's performance as the perfect political wife. That memory had been a splinter in my mind for years. Today, watching the woman who had relegated me to the kitchen being shoved out the back of the White House like discarded kitchen waste, I felt that splinter finally dissolve. The poetic justice was not a roar. It was a quiet, cold realization that I had spent my entire life playing a game designed to make me lose, and I had just decided to flip the board entirely. The service doors clicked shut, muffling the last of their pathetic protests. The ballroom, which had been vibrating with the chaos of the arrest, began the slow, awkward process of reassembling itself. The elite of the intelligence community and the high-ranking officials of the defense sector stood in pockets, their voices low, their eyes constantly darting toward me. I remained standing in the center of the floor, the iPad still tucked securely under my arm. I was no longer an outsider. I was the primary benefactor of the nation's most secure defensive technology. The room was shifting its orientation around me, much like a compass needle snapping toward a new magnetic north. Admiral Reed, whose reputation for steel-trap tactical brilliance was only matched by his immense political influence, broke away from a group of Joint Chiefs. He moved through the crowd with the heavy, rhythmic gait of a man who spent his life walking across aircraft carriers. He didn't look bothered by the scene that had just unfolded. To him, Richard Pierce was merely a failed asset being decommissioned. He stopped in front of me, his expression perfectly neutral, a ghost of a smile playing on his thin lips. He held a flute of vintage champagne in his left hand, and with a smooth, practiced motion, he signaled a nearby server to bring a fresh glass. The server hurried over, presenting it to me on a silver tray. I took the glass, the stem cool against my fingertips. Admiral Reed raised his flute, the golden liquid catching the harsh glare of the overhead lighting. He didn't look at me with the patronizing gaze Richard had always employed. Instead, he looked at me with the sharp, appraising eyes of a peer. He knew exactly who held the keys to the kingdom now. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Reed announced, his voice booming with a natural authoritative resonance that silenced the remaining murmurs in the room. He didn't need a microphone. His presence was sufficient. "Let us return to the real business of the evening, the signing of the Aegis Cybersecurity Defense Pact." The room breathed a collective sigh of relief, eager to pivot away from the embarrassment of the Pierce family's collapse and back into the comfortable, profitable realm of national security policy. As the crowd began to drift back toward the dais, I looked at the glass in my hand. I had spent my entire existence being told that I was a liability, that my ambition was an inconvenience, and that my intelligence was a threat to the established order. Now those same people were waiting for my nod, waiting for me to dictate the terms of our future. The Aegis Pact was more than just a defensive treaty. It was the ultimate consolidation of control. With the Pierce estate liquidated and Richard behind bars, the resources I had secured through Vanguard Holdings would allow me to reshape the industry from the inside out. I had spent years watching them build their towers of glass and hubris. I had spent the last 24 hours watching them fall. As the ceremony commenced, I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I had expected. Instead, I felt a deep, profound clarity. I had successfully excised the tumors from my life. My mother, my father, my sister. They were remnants of a version of me that no longer existed. I was the author of this new chapter, and for the first time I wasn't writing it to please anyone but myself. I sipped the champagne. It was dry, complex, and tasted exactly like victory. The Admiral took his place at the podium, and I walked up beside him. The flashbulbs began to fire again, but this time they weren't capturing the fall of a man. They were capturing the ascent of a woman who had finally claimed her own power. As the pen was placed before me, I didn't hesitate. I signed the documents that would bind the world's most powerful nations to the systems I had created, ensuring that the legacy of Pierce Logistics was buried and the era of Vanguard was born. When the signing was finished, I stepped back, observing the room. My parents' influence had been replaced by my own. The doors through which Catherine and Beatrice had been dragged were now closed, and I had no intention of ever opening them again. The world had just changed, and I was the one who had tipped the scale. The Admiral leaned in, his voice just audible over the polite applause of the diplomats. "You've done something truly remarkable tonight, Caroline. The transition of control was remarkably clean." I didn't smile. I just looked him in the eye and said, "The transition was necessary, Admiral. Legacy is often just a polite word for baggage, and I have finished unpacking." The room began to bustle as the guests moved toward the buffet tables, the incident with the Pierce family already fading into the background of a town that specialized in short memories. I stood alone at the edge of the stage watching the flow of power. My father's donors were now mine. My sister's social circle was now mine to dismantle or use as I saw fit. The landscape of my life had been flattened, and I was the only thing left standing on the horizon. I tapped the screen of my iPad again, bringing up the real-time status of the Vanguard acquisitions. One by one, the red lights were turning green as the remaining assets of Richard's empire were absorbed into my control. It was a rhythmic, satisfying display of total dominance. A young aide approached me hesitantly, holding a leather-bound folder. "Ms. Pierce, the briefing on the Asian Pacific infrastructure updates is ready for your review whenever you're available." I took the folder, the weight of it grounding me. "I am available now," I said, walking toward the quieter corner of the East Room. "The transition is complete. The work, however, is just beginning." As I sat down, I didn't look back at the ballroom. I didn't think about the tears, the screaming, or the frantic pleas of my mother. I thought about the sheer exhilarating coldness of absolute control and how much I enjoyed the silence that followed. I was finally truly in command. The ballroom hummed with a renewed electric energy. The departure of the Pierce family was not just a removal of unwanted guests, it was the symbolic clearing of a toxic atmosphere. I stood center stage, the spotlight reflecting off the sleek interface of the iPad still in my hands. The protocol officer signaled to the wings, and 3 more assistants appeared, each carrying secure physical copies of the Aegis Cybersecurity Defense Pact. I took my position behind the podium. The crowd, previously comprised of sycophants who had been waiting for Richard's next move, were now looking at me with undisguised curiosity. They had witnessed the absolute annihilation of the Pierce patriarch, and they were calculating my next move with the intensity of predators. General Holloway, a man whose career had been defined by decades of rigid military hierarchy and a deep-seated distrust of civilian contractors, moved toward the front of the stage. He adjusted his medals, his brow furrowed as he looked at the contract in my hand. His voice, rasping and gravelly, carried over the room. "Ms. Pierce," he began, gesturing vaguely toward the sprawling defense pact at 34. "Are you prepared to handle the full weight of the nation's cyber logistics? This is the most sensitive infrastructure network in the free world. We don't need a corporate prodigy. We need a strategist who knows what happens when the lights go out." The room held its breath. It was the quintessential test. They wanted to know if I was simply a girl who had inherited her father's influence, or if I had the intellectual armor to survive the scrutiny of the Joint Chiefs. I didn't reach for a script. I didn't glance at the aides. I looked General Holloway in the eye and began a structural breakdown of the Aegis protocol. I detailed the adaptive AI defense architecture I had spent the last 3 years perfecting, explaining how the system predicted and neutralized zero-day vulnerabilities in real time long before any human operator could detect them. I spoke of packet layer encryption, the redundancy of our satellite uplink grid, and the failsafes I had built into the network's core logic that rendered external breaches theoretically impossible. I spoke for 6 minutes. My delivery was precise, devoid of the flowery corporate jargon Richard had always insisted upon, and packed with the cold, hard logic of systems engineering. When I finished, I didn't ask if I was prepared. I stopped speaking and waited. General Holloway stared at me, his mouth slightly parted. The skepticism in his posture vanished, replaced by a begrudging, genuine respect. He didn't say another word. He simply stepped aside, leaving the path clear for the final signature. I turned to the heavy mahogany table. I reached into the breast pocket of my blazer and pulled out a simple, tarnished fountain pen. It was the same pen Richard had once swiped off his desk during a heated argument when I was 20, back when he was convinced I would never be more than a glorified secretary for his empire. He had thrown it into the trash can, laughing as he told me I'd never have a reason to sign anything of importance in my life. I had retrieved it from the bin the moment he left the room. I uncapped the pen, feeling the familiar cheap plastic against my thumb, and pressed the nib to the thick white paper of the contract. With a single fluid movement, I signed my name. The ink blotted perfectly. The barrage of camera flashes that erupted in that moment was blinding, a wall of white light that cemented my transition from the family scapegoat to the new architect of national security. 1 month later, the frantic energy of the White House had been replaced by the steady, quiet hum of my new life. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office in Washington, D.C. The sprawling city spread out beneath me like a circuit board. A dark black coffee rested on the minimalist glass desk behind me. On the wall-mounted television, a news anchor was mid-sentence. Former Pierce Logistics CEO Richard Pierce and his associate Xavier Thorne were denied bail today in a federal courtroom. The anchor reported, their faces grim. Both men are facing 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy and massive financial fraud. Meanwhile, reports have surfaced regarding the current status of Catherine Pierce and her daughter Beatrice, who were spotted yesterday at a suburban strip mall working in a local retail storefront. The pair are currently liquidating their personal belongings to offset the massive debt left in the wake of the Vanguard Holdings buyout. The Pierce empire wasn't just gone, it had been erased. The door to my office opened with a sharp, crisp click. Admiral Reed entered, walking with a folder tucked firmly under his arm. He didn't knock, and he didn't wait for an invitation. He walked straight to my desk, his demeanor entirely different than it had been a month ago. The patronizing peer-to-peer gaze was gone, replaced by a genuine professional deference that acknowledged my role as the primary stakeholder in the nation's defense. He placed a thick classified file in front of me. It was stamped with the highest level of clearance. "We've reviewed the progress on the Aegis secondary rollout," Reed said, his voice low and serious. "The metrics are exceeding our most optimistic projections. The Secretary of Defense wants to know if we can initiate the full-scale integration by Q3. I looked at the folder, then out the window at the city that had once been my father's playground and was now a piece on my chessboard. The sensation of absolute untarnished control was intoxicating, but I didn't let it cloud my judgment. I turned back to the Admiral, a thin, sharp smile touching my lips. I was no longer the daughter who ate in the kitchen. I was the one who decided who sat at the table. I tapped the folder, my fingers steady and calm. "Let's get to work, Admiral," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet, expansive office. "We have an empire to build." The most profound lesson from Caroline's journey is that true empowerment comes from stripping away the toxic expectations others place upon you. For years, Caroline allowed her family's narrative of her inadequacy to dictate her self-worth, only to realize that their validation was a trap designed to keep her subservient. By shifting her focus from seeking their approval to building her own empire, she transformed her status from an ignored scapegoat into the master of her own destiny. Authentic success is not found in pleasing those who belittle you, but in reclaiming the power to define your own value. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic expectations to build your own success? Share your journey in the comments below.